Josephine Calloway arrived in Miles City with a sewing case, a single trunk, and nowhere left to return to. Before she had taken 10 steps off the train, the town already believed it, knew exactly who she was, a woman who had ruined a good man's life and fled Louisiana before anyone could ask why. She never argued. Some truths cost innocent people more than silence ever would. So she let strangers judge her, closed every door behind her, and expected nothing from anyone. Then she met a quiet horse breeder who did something no one else had bothered to do. He learned her name before he believed the story. And when she finally whispered, "There's no one waiting for me anymore," his answer wasn't pity. It was a promise. The train put her off at Miles City a little after noon, and the first thing Josephine Calloway noticed was that the wind here did not smell like anything she knew. No river mud, no magnolia, only grass and distance and a cold that had no business being there in May. She stood on the platform with her trunk and her sewing case, the leather one with her initials worn nearly smooth, and found the nearest fixed point, the way she always did in unfamiliar places, a water tower, something that wasn't moving. Elias had written that he would meet her train. He had not written that he wouldn't be able to. The station master was the one who told her gently, in the flat and careful voice men use when they have delivered this kind of news before and know there is no good way to do it. An accident at the sawmill. A support beam, a length of chain, bad luck compounding on bad timing. 3 days before her train pulled in. He gave her the name of the boarding house where her brother had been staying and the direction of the mill, and he did not ask if she had somewhere to go because it was clear from her face that she was still deciding that herself. She walked to the mill because she did not know what else to do with her body. She was not looking for grief there. She was looking for the last place Elias had stood. The foreman met her at the gate, hat in his hands, and behind him a man was crossing the yard with a length of rope over one shoulder, and the unhurried economy of movement that comes from doing physical work every day of your life. He stopped when he saw her. He did not need to be told who she was. "You'd be Elias's sister," he said. Not a question. "Josephine," she said. "Josie. Caleb Ashford." He set the rope down against a fence post, as if he understood that shaking her hand mattered more than finishing his errand. "Your brother helped me break a colt last fall. Good man. Careful with his hands." He paused. "I'm sorry for what happened here." She had heard variations of that sentence a dozen times already, from strangers in this town, delivered with the same practiced solemnity people use for weather they didn't cause and can't undo. His was different. He said it like a man reporting a fact he wished were not true, not like a man performing sympathy for an audience of one. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," she said. "Caleb," he said. "Everybody here's going to call you the Calloway girl for a month, whether you like it or not. Seemed like the least I could do was get your name right first. It was such a small thing. A name said correctly by someone who had no reason to bother. But she had been Miss Calloway and the deceased's sister, and that poor girl from Louisiana for 3 days, now spoken about more than spoken to, and something in her chest loosened slightly at hearing her own name used the way a name is meant to be used, like it belonged to her and not to the situation. She held herself very still so it wouldn't show. "You'll be staying at Odell's," he said. It wasn't quite a question either. "That's where your brother was." "I believe so. I haven't been yet. I'll walk you as far as the corner. I've got a wagon there." He picked the rope back up, slung it over the same shoulder, and did not offer his arm, did not offer condolences again, did not ask her a single question about New Orleans, or what she planned to do now that the reason she'd come west was 3 days in the ground. He simply walked, matching his pace to hers, without announcing that he was doing it, and let the silence between them be the kind that doesn't need filling. At the corner, before he turned toward his wagon, he stopped. "Your brother talked about you," he said. Said you could make a shirt fit a man better than the man himself understood his own shoulders. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Said you were coming out here to open a shop. I hope that's still true. Town could use it. I hope so too, she said, and meant it more than she expected to. He touched his hat brim and left her there, and Josie stood on the corner of a street she did not know in a town that did not know her, holding a trunk that contained everything she had left in the world, and thought that this was the first conversation since Tennessee, since before Tennessee, if she was honest, in which no one had needed anything from her. He hadn't asked her to explain herself. He hadn't looked at her the way people had started looking at her in New Orleans in the last month before she left, weighing her against a story they'd heard and finding her short of it. He had simply gotten her name right and told her the truth about her brother and walked beside her as far as the corner. It was not much. She reminded herself of that as she carried her own trunk the rest of the way to Odell's, refusing the porter's help, out of a habit of self-sufficiency 4 years old. It was not much a name said correctly and a short walk with a stranger, but she had learned the hard way to notice when someone did not need anything from her. It happened rarely enough that she'd stopped expecting it, and some small, unguarded part of her, the part she kept locked well beneath the composed woman who had buried a fiancé's promises and now a brother in the same 12 months, made a note of it. Anyway, the way you mark a landmark you might need to find again. The Baxter storefront sat empty on Main Street with a "To Let" sign, so weathered the paint had given up on the second word, leaving only a ghost of it in the grain. Elias had written to her about this exact building, good light from the north window, close enough to the boarding houses that women wouldn't have to hire a wagon to bring their mending. He had spoken to the owner. He had made in his last letter something that sounded very close to a promise. The owner was Silas Corwin, and he received her in the back office of the Mercantile. He ran on the corner behind a desk stacked with ledgers that had nothing to do with her. "Your brother inquired," Corwin said, not quite meeting her eyes. He was a compact man with a Mercantile owner's practiced neutrality, the kind of face built for setting prices without apology. "Nothing was signed. I'm afraid the space isn't available. The sign in the window says otherwise. The sign needs replacing." He said this without embarrassment, as though the inconvenience of the lie belonged to her, not him. "I have another party interested." She had spent 4 years running a household on a widow's pension and a dressmaker's income, and she knew the sound of a closed door dressed up as an open one. She did not argue. Arguing with a man who has already decided costs more than it buys. "I understand," she said, and rose to leave, and it was on her way out past the front counter that she caught the look on his face change, not guilt, something more careful than guilt. The look of a man checking whether a thing he'd heard was true by studying the person it was about. His daughter was behind the counter. Adeline Corwin, perhaps 19, arranging bolts of cloth with the proprietary care of someone whose livelihood depended on being the only option in town. She did not look up as Josie passed. She did not need to. Something in the set of her shoulders had already delivered its verdict. Outside, Caleb Ashford was tying his wagon at the rail, his daughter beside him, a slight, serious girl of 11 with her father's steady eyes and a braid that had clearly been done by someone still learning how. "Miss Calloway." He touched his hat. "This is Nora." Nora studied her, the way children study things they haven't been told the rules for yet, not unkindly, just thoroughly cataloging. Her gaze moved from Josie's face to her hands, to the sewing case she still carried everywhere out of habit, as if it were the one object in the world she could be certain of. "You made Papa's good shirt," Nora said. It wasn't a question. "Uncle Elias said so." "I did," Josie said, surprised into a small smile. "I hope it still fits him. He's put on weight since fall," Nora said gravely, and Caleb made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a warning. And for a moment, brief, unguarded, Josie felt something in the day loosen that had been clenched since she'd stepped off the train. It didn't last. Corwin came to the mercantile door behind her, arms crossed, watching the three of them with an expression she couldn't quite place until she understood it. A moment later, he was recalculating something. Whatever he had heard about her, and she was now certain he had heard something. He had not expected the town's most respected horse breeder to be standing on the walk in easy conversation with her, letting his daughter talk about shirts. "Ashford," Corwin said. "Silas." Caleb's voice didn't change, but something in his posture did a fraction more still, the way a man gets when he registers a current under a conversation without yet knowing its source. "Miss Calloway was just leaving," Corwin said. "I was," Josie agreed, evenly, giving him nothing. She walked back toward Odell's with her sewing case against her hip, and the particular hollowness of watching a door close on something she hadn't even known she was hoping for. The shop. The North Light. Her brother's last unfinished promise to her. She had not told Caleb Ashford why Corwin had refused her. She had not told him because she did not yet know the shape of the reason herself, only that Corwin's eyes had done something when he looked at her that had nothing to do with lease agreements. She had seen that look before, on faces in New Orleans, in her last weeks there. The look of someone who has heard a story about you and is checking it against your face, deciding which one to believe. She had hoped foolishly that 400 miles would be enough distance to leave a story behind. That evening, she sat on the edge of the bed Mrs. Odell had given her in the room that had been her brother's, and did not unpack the trunk. She told herself it was because she hadn't decided how long she was staying. It was closer to the truth to say that unpacking felt like agreeing to be seen, and she was no longer certain what this town had already decided it saw. Elias's belongings filled one trunk and a canvas kit bag, and Mrs. Odell brought them up to the room without ceremony, saying only that she'd kept them safe and hadn't looked through them, which Josie understood to mean she'd looked through them exactly once, briefly, out of the practical need to know if anything was owed to anyone. There wasn't much. A carpenter's level. A spare shirt, folded with more care than her brother had ever folded anything in his life, which told her someone, perhaps Mrs. Odell herself, had done it for him after. A tin of nails, a small clock that had stopped, and at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief that still smelled faintly of cedar, a letter addressed to their mother, in Elias's careful, slightly leaning hand. The wax seal was broken, snapped clean in half, not torn, as though he had sealed it, and then later decided against sending it, and broken the seal himself to add something more. She should not have read it. She told herself that even as she was reading it, sitting on the edge of the bed, with the last of the daylight coming through the window. Her brother's voice rising up off the page in a way that made her hands go still. "Mother," he had written, "I have to tell you what really happened with Josie and the Deschamps boy, because I don't believe what's being said, and I think you don't either, not truly, you're only saying it because it's easier than the alternative. I had it from Marguerite Fontaine, who had it from her sister who works in that house. It wasn't Josie who broke it off out of some whim or wandering eye like people are saying. Old Deschamps told her she'd have to stop sending you money, stop looking in on you at all if she wanted Julienne. Said a wife of his son's couldn't be seen keeping up a poor widow's household, said it reflected on the family. Josie told him no. She never told a soul why she really left that house, not even you, because saying it means the Deschamps name gets dragged through it. And those younger children of his, the ones who didn't do anything, they're the ones who'd pay for that scandal alongside their father. So she let people say what they wanted about her instead. I think that's the bravest thing I've ever heard of a person doing, and the stupidest, both at once, and I don't know what to do with knowing it, except..." The letter stopped there. Unfinished, the sentence hanging the way Elias himself had been left hanging, a life stopped mid-thought 3 days before hers arrived, to find out how the sentence would have ended. She sat with it a long time. Long enough that the room went from gold to gray to nearly dark, and she did not light the lamp because there was something in sitting in the growing dark with her brother's unfinished handwriting that felt like the only honest way to receive it. He had known. He had known the whole time, and he had never once written to ask her to explain herself, had only invited her west with the quiet, unstated understanding that a fresh start didn't require an accounting of the old one. She had spent 4 months since leaving New Orleans, bracing for anyone to ask her outright why Julian Deschamps's family had let it be known she'd jilted him. Her own brother had known the truth and simply loved her anyway, without needing her to prove it. A knock came at the door, and she folded the letter fast instinctively, the way you'd pull a hand back from a flame, and tucked it beneath the shirt in the trunk before she answered. It was Caleb with an armload of split wood for the room's small stove, Nora trailing behind him with a jar of something that turned out to be preserves. "Mrs. Odell said you hadn't asked for wood," he said. "Nights still get cold here even in May. You didn't have to do that. I know." He set the wood by the stove without making a production of it, businesslike, already turning to go. Nora wanted to bring the preserves, her own doing, not mine. "Papa doesn't like choke cherry," Nora said, setting the jar on the small table with the solemnity of a diplomatic gift. "So we always have extra." Josie thanked them both and stood in the doorway after they'd gone, one hand resting flat against the trunk lid, as though she could feel the letter through the wood. She had not shown it to him. She had not shown it to anyone, and some clear, quiet part of her already understood that she wasn't going to not, because she didn't trust Caleb Ashford, whom she had known for exactly 2 days and already trusted more than she could account for, but because the letter wasn't only hers to spend. It would cost the Deschamps children something. It always had from the first day she'd chosen silence over vindication. She had simply not expected the choice to follow her 400 miles and sit in a trunk waiting to be made again. Mrs. Odell was a broad, capable woman, somewhere past 50, who ran her boarding house the way a good foreman runs a crew, firmly, fairly, with no patience for anyone who didn't pull their share. She offered Josie a reduced rate in exchange for mending the boarders' clothes, an arrangement that was, Josie understood, as much an act of quiet charity as it was a business transaction, though Mrs. Odell would have denied both if asked. "You'll want thread," Mrs. Odell said, surveying Josie's kit with a practical eye. "Real thread, not the tangle Elmer's got at the mercantile. There's a peddler comes through Thursdays." "I'll manage," Josie said, and did, spending an evening working indigo dye from a crushed bit of choke cherry skin and a borrowed pot until she had something close enough to the blue she needed to mend a torn coat lining without the patch announcing itself. The work suited her better than she expected. There was comfort in it, in the plain arithmetic of a torn seam, and its remedy a problem that stayed solved once she'd solved it. Among the boarders was a freight clerk named Whitcomb, who brought her 3 shirts with collars worn through and paid an extra dime without being asked. And a schoolteacher, Miss Ainsley, who wept a little unguarded when Josie let out the waist of a dress the woman had been too proud to admit no longer fit. Josie said nothing about the tears. She had learned long ago that some kindnesses were best delivered without comment, the way you'd hand someone a handkerchief without remarking on why they needed it. Caleb came by only once that week, dust still ground into the creases of his shirt from 3 days of branding calves in the home pasture, and stayed only long enough to drop off a saddle blanket, with a torn corner declining twice her offer of coffee. "Cattle won't wait on coffee," he said, though he lingered at the porch rail a moment longer than the excuse required before he went. Josie mended the blanket that evening and told herself the extra care she put into the stitching had nothing to do with whose hands would hold the reins next to it. Nora appeared on the boarding house porch most afternoons that first week, ostensibly to deliver something from her father eggs. A message once a startled and disgruntled hen that had escaped the wagon, but staying afterward to watch Josie work. She had torn her own coat, climbing a fence rail she'd been told not to climb, and Josie mended it while Nora sat cross-legged on the porch, Board's chin on her knees, watching the needle move with an intensity children usually reserved for something more dangerous than sewing. Papa tries to mend things, Nora said. He's not good at it. Everything ends up puckered. Most people are bad at things they were never taught, Josie said. It isn't a fault. Did somebody teach you? My mother mostly, and necessity. Josie tied off a stitch bit the thread did not elaborate. Nora was quiet for a while, watching the needle catch the afternoon light. Then, with the unhurried directness particular to children who have not yet learned that some questions are considered impolite, she said, Papa says people in town are saying things about you. Mean things. Why don't you just tell them they're wrong? The needle did not stop moving. Josie had gotten very good over 4 months at keeping her hands steady no matter what her chest was doing. Sometimes, she said carefully, telling people they're wrong costs more than letting them think what they think. That doesn't seem fair. No, Josie agreed. It isn't. Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things, turning it over visibly, the way a person turns over a stone to see what's underneath. Papa says the ones worth knowing will figure it out eventually. He says that's how he knew Mama wasn't like the others in her family, even though everybody said she was too particular to make a rancher's wife. A small private smile crossed her face, gone as quickly as it came. He was right about her. Mrs. Odell says he's usually right about people, even when it takes him a while to say so out loud. Josie kept her eyes on the coat lining. Your father sounds like a patient man. He's stubborn, Nora said with the frank affection of a daughter cataloging a parent's flaws. It's not always the same thing as patient, but sometimes it is. She did not answer Nora's original question that day, and Nora did not ask again, seeming to understand with an instinct sharper than her 11 years should have allowed that some silences were not meant to be filled by force. She simply stayed on the porch a while longer, swinging her mended coat around her shoulders once it was done, declaring the stitching invisible with the authority of a satisfied customer, and left with a wave that Josie found herself watching longer than the moment warranted. That night, Josie sat with the coat's leftover scraps of indigo thread wound around her fingers and thought about the difference between the question Nora had asked and the one Nora hadn't not. Why won't you tell them, but why do you let it cost you so much to protect people who aren't even here to see it? She did not have a clean answer to that one either. She only knew that 4 months ago, standing in a parlor in New Orleans, with Julienne's father's ultimatum laid out plainly before her, she had made a choice, and she was the kind of person who did not go back and unmake her choices simply because they had followed her somewhere new and inconvenient. It cost something to be that kind of person. She was only beginning to understand in this town of dry wind and long light exactly how much. She thought, too, of something her mother had told her once back in the house on Rampart Street, folding linens by lamplight. The winter before she died, that a woman's dignity was the one inheritance nobody could contest in probate court, because nobody else could see it well enough to fight over it. Josie had not understood the remark at 16. She understood it better now, sitting on a Montana porch with a child's mended coat across her knees, 400 miles from anyone who remembered her mother's voice at all. The invitation came through Mrs. Odell, who delivered it the way she delivered most things, as fact rather than request. The women of Riverside Chapel held a quilting circle every second Thursday, and Mrs. Odell had put Josie's name forward without asking first, on the theory, she said, that a woman needed to be seen doing ordinary things among ordinary women before the extraordinary things people said about her could take proper root. It was Josie understood only after she arrived already too late for that particular strategy. The circle met in the chapel's side room. A quilting frame worn smooth by 3 generations of hands stretched across sawhorses, a dozen women arranged around it with needles and low conversation. The frame itself had a history, the women recited with the ease of people who'd told it 100 times, built by the chapel's first congregation. In a dugout winter passed down through 3 sets of hands, patched itself in places where the wood had split. Josie took a seat at the edge, accepted a threaded needle from a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Lundgren, and worked in careful silence for the better part of an hour, grateful to be for once simply a pair of competent hands. It was Vera Corwin who broke the peace. Silas Corwin's wife was a narrow, sharp-chinned woman with the particular confidence of someone who had never once doubted her own correctness, and she set her needle down with the air of a woman who had been building toward a remark all afternoon. "My cousin writes to me from New Orleans," Vera said to the quilt in general, though her eyes found Josie's face and stayed there. She had the most curious letter last month, about a broken engagement. A Deschamps boy and a Calloway girl who left him standing at the altar, practically no explanation, given no apology offered to the family. She smoothed a fold of fabric with unnecessary care. Small world, isn't it? The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when everyone in it already knows what's being discussed and is only waiting to see how the person it concerns will respond. Josie kept her eyes on her stitches. Her hands, she was distantly proud to notice, did not shake. "It is a small world," she said, "and nothing else," and drew her needle through the fabric in a line so straight it might have been ruled with a pencil. Vera waited for more. When nothing came, something flickered across her face, not quite disappointment, but close to it. The particular frustration of a woman who has thrown a stone expecting a splash and gotten only silence. A few of the other women exchanged glances. One, Mrs. Lundgren, made a small sound that might have been disapproval, though whether it was aimed at Josie or at Vera was not entirely clear. The quilting continued. The conversation moved elsewhere the way conversations do when no one will feed them, though. Josie could feel the shape of the silence differently now. A few of the women's needles moving a fraction slower, a few glances that lingered a beat too long. She said nothing more for the rest of the hour. She had learned 4 months ago, and many times since, that dignity under observation was its own kind of armor, and that the moment you reached to defend yourself, you handed your audience the satisfaction of having provoked a reaction. It was old, Mrs. Pruitt, easily 70, who came to sit beside her as the circle broke up and the women began gathering their things. She did not say anything about Vera's remark, did not ask a single question about New Orleans. She simply settled into the chair, examined Josie's line of stitches with the assessing eye of a woman who had judged a great many quilts in her lifetime, and said, "That's fine work, fine as any I've seen come through this room." "Thank you," Josie said, unsteadied more by the kindness than she had been by Vera's needling. Mrs. Pruitt patted her hand once briefly, her palm dry and warm, and said nothing further, only Rose gathered her shawl and left. It was such a small gesture. A hand on a hand, 4 seconds, no words attached to explain it. But Josie sat with it a long moment after the room had emptied, understanding that it had been in its quiet way a choice. One old woman deciding in front of the others which version of the story she believed, without ever once naming the story at all. Caleb was outside when she finally left, waiting by the chapel rail, with his wagon ostensibly there to collect feed sacks from the mercantile next door. "Storm's building west of the Yellowstone," he said, nodding at a gray line stacking along the horizon. "Let me carry you back before it breaks." She let him, and for the short ride said nothing about the quilting circle at all, and he did not ask, and the silence between them, she was coming to understand, was its own kind of conversation. Walking the last stretch to Odell's after he'd set her down, Josie found she was holding herself differently than she had that morning. Not lighter exactly, but less alone in the holding. She thought about Mrs. Pruitt's hand on hers the rest of the way, turning it over, the way she'd turned over Elias's letter. A small, exact thing offered without explanation, and somehow more convincing for it. She had spent 4 months believing that vindication, if it ever came, would have to arrive loudly in the form of someone standing up in a room and declaring her innocent. She was beginning to suspect it more often arrived quietly, one dry, warm hand at a time, from people who had simply decided on their own to look closer. The man's name was Elmer Voss, a horse buyer up from Ogallala, who'd once done business in New Orleans and mentioned it in passing, while dickering with Caleb over the price of a gelding. He mentioned other things too, in the easy way traveling men trade gossip like currency, and by the time he'd finished with the story, Josephine Calloway, the broken engagement, the family that wouldn't say why Caleb had stopped haggling over the horse entirely. He did not go to Josie that evening. He told himself it was because he had chores that couldn't wait, and there was truth enough in that to make the lie comfortable. He sent Nora's promised dress by way of his hired man, instead, a note attached, explaining a delay at the ranch, and he did not visit the boarding house for 4 days, which was 3 days longer than any absence in the 2 weeks since he'd met her, and long enough that even Nora noticed. The rumor, meanwhile, did more than travel. It cost her something. Mrs. Whitcomb, who had promised Jo the making of a wedding dress for her niece, sent word by her own boy that the order was canceled, no reason offered. Though the boy, perhaps 8, delivered the message with the guileless bluntness of a child, repeating exactly what he'd heard at his family's supper table. "Mama says decent women don't take work from a woman who broke a man's heart for sport." Josie thanked him for carrying the message, and did not correct him, and stood a long moment after he'd gone, holding the half-finished bodice she would now have to unpick, thread by thread, and sell for scrap cloth. "You didn't take me to see Miss Calloway," Nora said on the 3rd evening, not quite an accusation, watching her father from across the supper table. "Been busy with the branding," he said, which was also true, and also not the reason. I knew what he was doing. He had done it before, 4 years past, when word first got around that his late wife Margaret came from a family her own mother's people considered beneath a rancher's notice. He remembered exactly how long it had taken him to stop hearing other people's version of her and start trusting his own eyes again. He had told himself then that he wouldn't make that particular mistake twice, and here he was making it, turning a story over in his mind that he hadn't heard from the one person who'd actually lived it, weighing a stranger's second-hand account against 2 weeks of watching Josephine Calloway mend a torn coat for free and hold her composure through Vera Corwin's needling without once raising her voice. It wasn't that he believed Elmer Voss's version. It was that he didn't know what to do with not knowing, and not knowing had a way of making a careful man cautious, and caution looked from the outside exactly like doubt, she noticed. Of course she noticed. She had spent a lifetime reading the exact temperature of a room, and Caleb Ashford's absence registered on her the way a change in weather registers on someone who has learned to watch the sky. Between his silence and the canceled order, she spent one long evening with her trunk half packed again, telling herself she was only sorting, not leaving, though she knew the difference and chose not to examine it too closely. She did not ask Mrs. Odell if anything had been said about her. She did not need to. She recognized the shape of this particular silence. It had a twin in New Orleans in the weeks before Julian's father laid out his terms, when the whole household had gone quiet and careful around her, in a way that told her everything before anyone said a word. She told herself, mending shirts by lamplight, that she had not expected anything different. That expecting nothing was the whole architecture she'd built to survive the last 4 months. And it was still standing, and that was something. It did not feel like something. It felt like the 5th day, then the 6th, counting an absence the way she'd once told herself she'd stopped counting absences at all. On the seventh day, Caleb came to the boarding house porch alone without Nora, without an errand to disguise the visit as anything but what it was. Josie was on the porch step with a boarder's trousers across her lap, and she did not look up right away when his shadow crossed the boards. "I heard something," he said without preamble, because he had never been a man for easing into a hard thing. "About New Orleans, from Voss the horse buyer. I imagine you did." She kept her eyes on the seam. "It's a small world. Mrs. Corwin said so herself at the quilting circle. Cost me the Whitcomb order too, if you're keeping a tally." I went still at that something moving across his face that looked for the first time since she'd met him like plain regret. "I didn't know about the order." "No reason you should have." I was quiet a moment. "I should have come sooner. Instead of turning it over by myself for a week like a coward while it was costing you real money, and I never once thought to ask." She looked up at that. It was not the word she had expected from him, not an excuse, not a defense of his silence, but a plain naming of what it had been. "Most people don't call it that," she said. "Most people call it prudence." "Most people are wrong about a lot of things," he said. "I've been wrong about a few myself, and it generally starts with trusting a stranger's story over my own two eyes." He sat down on the step, not close, leaving a careful distance between them that felt somehow more respectful than if he'd sat nearer. "I'm not asking you to explain anything to me, Josie. I've watched you 2 weeks now. That tells me more than Elmer Voss ever could." She set the trousers down in her lap, her hands finally still. "Then why did you stay away?" "Because I wasn't sure yet whether I was watching you or watching what I wanted to see," he said. "Took me a week to work out that those were the same thing in your case." He looked at her directly, then the way he had the first day at the mill, reading what was actually there. "I'm sorry it took that long. Sorrier still for what it cost you while I was working it out." It was, she thought, the most honest apology anyone had offered her in 4 months, not a denial that doubt had happened, only an accounting of how he'd worked through it, what it had cost, and where he'd landed. She did not tell him about the letter that night. But something in her some long-guarded room opened a fraction wider than it had before, and she found she did not immediately want to close it again. It was Nora who nearly found it not through prying, but through the ordinary chaos of an 11-year-old, sorting Josie's mending basket for a missing hair ribbon and lifting Elias's folded shirt to look beneath it, the handkerchief-wrapped letter tumbling half out before Josie caught her wrist gently and took it back. "What is that?" Nora asked, more curious than alarmed. "Something of my brother's," Josie said. "Not for reading." Nora, to her credit, did not ask again. But she mentioned it to her father that evening the way children mention things without weighing their consequence. A letter wrapped up, careful that Miss Calloway didn't want anyone touching, and Caleb, riding out the next morning to deliver a mended bridle, found himself asking about it before he'd decided to. "Nora said there's a letter," he said. "Something of Elias's you're keeping close." Josie stood in the boarding house yard with the bridle in her hands, and she understood with sudden clarity that she had reached the place in the road where she had to choose again, the same choice she'd made in a New Orleans parlor 4 months ago, except this time the person asking wasn't demanding anything of her. He was simply present and willing to wait in a way that made the old defenses feel less necessary than they had in a long time. She thought of the quilting circle, of Mrs. Pruitt's hand on hers, of Vera Corwin's careful cruelty dressed up as small talk, of the Whitcomb order she'd had to unpick thread by thread. She thought of how much smaller the secret had felt once one person outside her own family knew the shape of it. And she thought, too, of Elias 3 days in the ground before she'd ever reached him, who had carried this same knowledge alone for months, without once making her feel the weight of it. She did not want to hand Caleb that same solitary burden. She wanted, for the first time since New Orleans, to simply be known. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you." She read it to him at the kitchen table, in Mrs. Odell's absence, her voice steady until the last unfinished sentence where it was not steady at all. Caleb listened without interrupting, his hands flat on the table, and when she finished, he sat with it a long moment before he spoke. He never told anyone. No. He wrote it to our mother and never sent it. I don't know if he was protecting me or working out how to say it, or both. She folded the letter along its old creases, careful of the broken seal. It doesn't matter now. I know what it says. That's enough. You could use it, Caleb said carefully. Corwin's wife has been telling half the town a story that isn't true. This would end it. It would end it by dragging Julian's younger brothers and sisters into it, Josie said. They didn't ask their father to make me that offer. They'd only be the ones left holding the shame of it, same as before, except now spread across 400 miles instead of contained to one city. She met his eyes. I made a choice 4 months ago about what I was willing to let it cost me. I haven't changed my mind just because the town found out anyway. I was quiet turning that over, the way she'd watched him turn over difficult things before, not quickly, but thoroughly. That's a hard thing to carry alone. I've had practice, I know. Something in his voice caught just slightly. I've watched you carry it 2 weeks now without once asking anybody to help you with the weight of it. Doesn't mean you have to keep doing it that way. Not around me. It was. She would think later the moment something shifted for good. Not a declaration, not a purple, nothing so large as that. Only a man sitting across a kitchen table having heard the whole true shape of her choosing not to fix it, not to expose it, not to manage it on her behalf, but simply to know it and stay. She had spent 4 months bracing to be believed, and had not fully considered what it would feel like once she was. Thank you, she said, for not telling me what I should do with it. Wasn't my letter to have an opinion about, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, familiar now. Just mine to know if you were willing to trust me with it. Which you were. He rose, careful, unhurried. That's enough for today, I think. He left the letter with her and left her sitting at the table a long while after, and for the first time since Elias's unfinished sentence had stopped her cold. In a fading room, she felt the words settle into something less like a wound and more like a fact she could simply hold without it holding her. The spring remount sale brought half the territory into Miles City army buyers from the Fort ranchers from 3 counties. The whole of Main Street, thick with horses and dust, and the particular electric noise of a town doing its year's most important business all in 1 week. Everyone who was anyone in Miles City found a reason to walk that street during the sale. Everyone who wanted to be seen made certain they were seen there. Caleb had 3 geldings entered, and every reason to spend the day at the auction ring. Instead, on the 2nd morning, he came to Odell's with Nora and asked Josie plainly if she'd walk down to the sale with them. You have horses to sell, she said. I have a foreman who can call a price as well as I can, he said. I'd rather walk Main Street with my daughter and a friend if the friend's willing. She understood what he was offering before she agreed to it, and understood too what it would cost him, not in money, but in exactly the currency Vera Corwin had spent 2 weeks ago at the quilting frame. Every rancher, every buyer, every wife and sister and cousin of every family in 3 counties would watch Caleb Ashford walk that street beside her unhurried in full daylight. On the 1 week of the year, the whole territory was looking. I'm willing, she said. They walked slowly, the 3 of them, Nora between them, for the first stretch. And then, without discussion, drifting ahead, to watch a pen of yearlings leaving a space that neither of them moved to close, and neither of them widened either. Caleb did not walk fast the way a man walks who has somewhere else he'd rather be. He matched his pace to Josie's, the same unhurried rhythm, from their first afternoon at the mill, and he stopped when she stopped to look at a bolt of cloth in the mercantile window, or a mare he admired in the ring, And he said little because she understood now better than she had 2 weeks ago. His silence was never absence. It was attention. She saw Vera Corwin see them. She saw the particular stiffening in Vera's shoulders, the sharp word exchanged with a companion behind a gloved hand, and she felt the old instinct rise in her to look at the ground, to make herself smaller, to apologize with her posture for existing where she'd been told she oughtn't. She did not do it. She kept her chin level and her pace even, and beside her, Caleb did not so much as glance toward the whispering, as though it were weather too minor to interrupt a conversation about horses. Silas Corwin himself was at the auction ring, gavel in hand, calling the day's sale, and when Caleb's second gelding came up, and the bidding ran higher than any horse had gone all week, Corwin's eyes moved once briefly from the ring to where Josie stood at Caleb's side, and something in his expression recalculated the way it had the first day outside the mercantile. This was not a man losing standing by association. This was Miles City's most respected horse breeder standing in the open, at the year's busiest hour, entirely unbothered by what people were saying. Nora came back to them near noon with a candy stick and a report on every horse she'd seen worth reporting, and the day wore on, ordinary and unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered. Nothing dramatic happened. No one confronted them. No one said a word to their faces. It was Josie understood exactly the point. Caleb hadn't brought her there to make an argument. He had simply removed himself from the audience that expected him to be embarrassed and let the town do its arithmetic without him. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, as they walked back toward Odell's in the late afternoon, Nora skipping ahead with her second candy stick of the day. "I know," he said, echoing words she'd said to him once at the feed store of her memory, though they'd never actually stood at one together. And she realized with a small private ache that she had told this story to herself so many times, it had started arranging itself into scenes that hadn't quite happened, the way you rehearse a kindness you're hoping to receive. "Why then?" He considered the question with his usual care. "Because I spent a week deciding what I believed about you in private," he said. Seemed only honest to spend a day showing it in public. The change in Corwin's manner came slowly enough that Josie almost missed its beginning, fewer women crossing the street to avoid passing her outside the mercantile. A nod from Mrs. Lundgren that had warmth in it, now not just civility. And then 3 weeks after the remount sale, Adeline Corwin's dress shop lost its 2 best-paying customers in the same week. Both ranch wives who'd ridden out to Odell's instead, mending and orders in hand, having heard from Mrs. Pruitt that the Calloway girl's stitching was the finest in the territory, and her manner, whatever people used to say about it, was nothing but decent. Silas Corwin came to Odell's himself on a Tuesday, hat in hand, with none of the mercantile owner's cool remove he'd worn the first day Josie had asked about the Baxter storefront. "The space is available," he said without preamble, standing awkwardly in Mrs. Odell's front parlor. "If you're still interested." "Why now?" Josie asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer. Corwin had the grace to look uncomfortable rather than pretend otherwise. "Adeline's losing customers to you, regardless of whether you've got a proper shop or a mending pile on a boarding house porch," he said. "Seems foolish of me to keep an empty building standing between good business and my own daughter's competition when the competition's happening anyway." It was not an apology. She had not expected one, and found she did not need it. The offer itself, stripped of any pretense at warmth, told her everything she needed to know about what had actually changed in Silas Corwin's calculations. Not his heart, his ledgers. She almost said yes on the spot, out of the old habit of taking what was offered before it could be withdrawn again. 4 months ago she would have. But something in her had shifted since the train platform in May, some new, unfamiliar patience that let her sit with an offer and turn it over before deciding whether it was actually good or merely available. "I'll think on it," she said, which was true and which surprised him more than an outright refusal would have. She thought on it that evening, sitting on the boarding house porch, with her sewing case beside her, and what she found turning the offer over was that she did not want to build her future inside a building. Silas Corwin had only opened to her because his own interests demanded it. She had spent 4 months being weighed and measured, and finally accepted on other people's terms. She was in no hurry to start her business the same way. It was Caleb who mentioned the old grain shed at the edge of his property, almost in passing while they sat on Odell's porch 2 evenings later. "North-facing windows," he said. "Nobody's used it for anything but tool storage in 3 years. Good light once it's cleaned out. Might not have thought of you needing it if Nora hadn't pointed out I was talking myself into an excuse to visit more often." Nora from the porch, steps below, did not look up from her book, but the set of her shoulders suggested she'd heard every word and approved of her own cleverness. She rode out with him the following morning to see it for herself past the horse pens where 2 of his men were working a green colt on a long line past the near pasture where that spring's calves still wobbled close behind their mothers, bawling at nothing in particular. The grain shed stood at the property's northern edge, weathered gray, smelling of old oats and machine oil. But the windows, once she'd wiped a season of dust from the glass with her sleeve, let in exactly the light Elias had promised her 400 miles and a lifetime ago in a letter that had turned out to be the last true thing he ever wrote her. "I'd want to pay a fair rent," Josie said. "Not a favor. I'd expect nothing less," Caleb said, and there was something steady and unoffended in how quickly he agreed to it, as though he had anticipated exactly that condition and respected her enough not to argue against it. "I'll have Hollis draw up proper terms, same as I would with any tenant." It was, she understood, the opposite kind of offer from Corwin's, not made because his interests required it, but made plainly on fair terms by a man who wanted nothing from the arrangement, except her nearby and her business succeeding on its own footing. She had spent 4 months learning the difference between being rescued and being respected, and she recognized this immediately as the second thing. "I accept," she said, "on those terms." "Good." He nodded once, satisfied, and said nothing more about it, though she caught in the last of the evening light something in his face that looked very much like a man who had gotten exactly what he'd hoped for and was doing his level best not to show how much. The shop opened on a bright morning in early June. The old grain shed scrubbed and whitewashed. Josie's sign, "Calloway Dressmaking and Alterations," hung straight above the door, with Caleb's level still borrowed from Elias's old kit, to make certain of it. The leather sewing case that had traveled with her from New Orleans to a train platform, to a borrowed room at Odell's, now sat open on a proper work table, and above it, driven into the wall on a small nail, Caleb had placed without being asked, hung the pair of shears that had been the one thing to survive every leg of her journey intact. Vera Corwin was unexpectedly the first customer through the door. She came alone without her husband, without the sharp confidence she'd carried into the quilting circle, and she stood for a moment just inside the doorway, with a length of gray wool draped over one arm before she spoke. "I need a coat made up before the fall," she said, and then when Josie only waited, she added stiffly, as though the words cost her something to produce, "My cousin's letter said more than she rightly knew about. I understand that now. I shouldn't have repeated it the way I did." It was not quite an apology, in the same way Silas's offer of the storefront had not quite been kindness. But it was, Josie thought, the closest thing this town's particular grammar allowed, and she chose to accept it as such. "Gray wool takes well to a fitted collar," Josie said. "I can have you a pattern to look at Thursday." Vera nodded something in her shoulders, loosening, and left the length of wool on the counter, and that Josie understood was the whole of the reckoning this town was going to offer. It was enough. She had not opened this shop to be vindicated. She had opened it to work. Nora came by after school most afternoons that first week, appointing herself unofficial keeper of the thread drawer, and Caleb came by most evenings on some errand or other that grew progressively thinner as an excuse until by Friday he stopped bothering to invent one at all. He came that evening as the shop was closing, the light going long and gold through the north windows exactly as Elias had promised her it would, 4 months and a lifetime ago in a letter she still had folded in her trunk. Nora had gone ahead to see to the horses. The shop was quiet, smelling of new-cut wood and chalk, and the particular clean smell of cloth not yet touched by a needle. Town's talking less about New Orleans these days, Caleb said, leaning in the doorway. Talking more about how there's finally somewhere decent to get a coat made. Small mercies, Josie said and meant it. I was quiet a moment, turning his hat in his hands, the way she'd seen him do before difficult things. I've been thinking on something a long while now, he said. Since near enough the day I met you at the mill, if I'm honest, though I didn't have the sense to call it that yet. She set down the shears and weighted her heart doing something unsteady that she made no effort to disguise, not anymore, not with him. You told me once you had no one waiting for you, he said, back before you knew me well enough to say much else. He looked at her directly the way he had that first day reading what was actually there. I've thought about that a great deal. Didn't seem right a woman like you believing that, and me standing close enough to do something about it, and saying nothing, or worse, staying quiet a week when it cost you something real, and telling myself that was caution. Caleb, I'm not asking you to answer today, he said. I know how you are about being asked for things you haven't had time to weigh properly. I'm only telling you what's true so you can weigh it whenever you're ready. He took a breath, and the words that came after were plain, unhurried, entirely without performance. A fact stated, not a speech delivered. There's no one waiting for me either, not since Margaret. Hasn't been, not properly, not until a woman with a leather sewing case got off a train in May and got my daughter braiding thread instead of horses' tails. She laughed unsteadily and found there were tears in it too and did not try to separate the two. So when you say no one's waiting for you, he said, I'd like that not to be true anymore. Whenever you're ready to let it not be true. Outside, the last of the daylight was going gold over Main Street, over the Mercantile and the chapel steeple and the grain shed, turned dressmaker's shop, with her brother's shears hung proud on the wall. Josie thought of a train platform in May and a name said correctly by a stranger who hadn't needed anything from her, and a letter with a broken seal that had cost her 4 months of careful silence and given her in the end exactly this. There is now, she said. It was not a grand thing, the saying of it. No music swelled, no crowd gathered to witness it, only a man in a doorway, and a woman behind a work table and the ordinary gold light of an ordinary Montana evening. But she felt the words settle into the room, the way the right stitch settles into cloth, small, exact, and permanent, and she understood that this was what she had been sewing toward, without knowing it every single day since the train had put her down, in a town that did not yet know her name.
I think about that like a good deal. There is now, forward, and the undo performance of a woman convincing herself she will have to carry everything along forever, simply because carrying things along was the only roof she had that she could survive. There's a particular kind of strength in staying quiet to protect people who never know what it costs you. Josie had that strength in abundance, and it very nearly cost her the one thing she actually wanted. Someone willing to see past the story and wait for the truth to catch up on its own time. I don't think that's a small thing to learn at any age. Some of us learn it late, some of us are still learning it. I would love to know where you are watching from tonight. the city, the state, whenever the story found you. It always humbled me to hear how far this evening's travel. If Josie and Cable's story kept you company tonight, a like helps more than you think. And if you're glad to be here when the next one starts, I'm glad be I would be glad of the company until then. Take care of the people waiting for you. And if no one is yet, I hope you find the ones who will.